37 of us. 9 officers and 28 seamen aboard ship that trip. And you couldn't have found 3 who didn't think we were dead ducks. I sure as hell did. Not that the idea was in my noggin when we signed on in October. Far from it. I was just jumping at the bonus bait they waved under our noses to get us to ship out, in spite of the fact that we'd be lugging tanks and planes and other stuff for the limeys, with the Jerry subs itching to do a little short stopping. October 1941. Remember? All the war meant to me then was a chance to risk my neck and get a few extra bucks for doing it. We were going round the Cape of Good Hope. FDR had closed down the Mediterranean to U.S. shipping. Port Sudan and Suez were our destination to get this Lend-Lease stuff to the limeys before Rommel could get up steam. Don't ask me where we were exactly on December 7, because after Spock slugged us with the news, nobody gave a damn about our position. All that counted was how long it would take to get us where we were going, and then back to the States. It would take a long time. And so, as I said, almost every last guy aboard figured we were as good as dead. We dumped the cargo in Africa as per schedule and sailed in ballast for Calcutta. There we picked up manganese ore, talc, jute, mica, rubber, the usual, and something not so usual, too. We took a load of monkeys aboard. Rhesus monkeys the docs back home wanted for experiments with infantile paralysis. 500 of those jabbering monks were brought on as deck cargo, 20 of them to a cage, piled up on the afterdeck. And nobody gave them a second thought. Not then. Mostly at the time we were thinking about other things. I sure as hell was. Yeah. Women. The ship was tied up at Kittaport Docks No. 1, and just past the dock area was the native bazaar, crawling with people, including women. For as long as our ship was docked in Calcutta, I had me quite a time. Later, I got to be awful glad about that, because for a while, particularly when it started with the monks, I sure figured I'd seen my last female. But that's another story. I didn't start out to tell you that one. Any sailor's done the same or better. I'd like to see the guy, though, who can match what happened to our tub on April 6th. We kissed Calcutta goodbye on April 4, bound for Colombo and Ceylon. It figured to be a 5-day run, provided the ship stuck to 10 knots all the way. That was what the first counted on doing, and as engineers go, he was a pretty hep guy. I'd been on his black gang for the whole trip, and he'd get my vote any day of the year. Our ship was the usual freighter. You'll find them a dime a dozen in any U.S. port. A 5,800-tonner built in 1921, black-hulled with red boot topping and a buff funnel, masts forward and aft. You wouldn't enter her in a speedboat race, but all the same, she was a solid job. None of us was doing much horsing around when we lifted anchor. The news had been getting blacker and blacker. It was bad enough to have the Japs at war with us just when we were in their backyard, but then the Prince of Wales and the Repulse took nosedives, and the panic was on. Sparks, that old sour son of a bucket, got a bang out of putting up bulletins to put the fear of God into us. Around the middle of February, he let us know Singapore had fallen. Less than a month later, Sparks used Red Crayon to tell us that Rangoon had fallen. All you have to do is take a fast look at a map to see why we were jittery. Even before we left Calcutta, we'd learned that the Japs had swept the Limey fleet out of the Malayan Straits, and it didn't take a military genius to guess that the Jap Navy might very well give the Bay of Bengal a going over, which, in case you've forgotten, is where we sat. For 24 hours after we were on the move again, things were quiet. It was the day before Easter Sunday, and those of us on the 8 to 12 watch were shooting the breeze about what we'd be doing if we were back in the States. I was too busy chasing around oiling the engines, so I let the first and Kelsey, the fireman, do most of the jabbering. At 8 bells, when the second watch took over, the first and Kelsey and me went up to the mess hall to get our chow and find out what was buzzing. Nothing was buzzing. Sparks had told the boys the wire was quiet. Well, I didn't like that worth a damn, and I said so. It was too quiet. Something had to be brewing. Belly Rub, our chief cook who couldn't cook to save his neck, but who was a nice guy anyway, grinned and told me to go aft if it was noise I was after. The ship's engines gave me all the noise I wanted, but just the same, after chow, I drifted aft to the poop deck. I had nothing else to do, and besides, it was just like being at a zoo to watch those monks. Those brown-furred Indian devils were really something to see, with their bare faces and backsides. They looked enough like some humans I've bumped into to hand me a laugh. In each cage, the oldest male grabbed all the females for himself, and he'd beat the pajamas out of any other male who made a move in the wrong direction. So the males messed around among themselves, unless one of them could steal a female when the bull boss wasn't looking. You could hear the monks from some distance away. Just let a few get excited, and pretty soon the whole pack would be cutting loose with that shrill chirp of theirs. And if they really got worked up, they'd grab hunks of leftover potatoes or carrots or stale bread and hurl it out of their cages. Once I got conked with a hunk of potato, but I swear the monk who did it was kidding around. As soon as I turned my back again, he let fly with another hunk. For as long as they were riding on our rust buckets, they were at the mercy of the bosun and the carpenter. These two washed the cages down with a hose every morning, fed the animals twice a day, put the sick in separate cages, and dropped the dead overboard. Getting the sick and dead out of the cages could be risky business if the monks were worked up, and if a guy wasn't careful. A 2-foot bull has teeth that work like meat choppers, and when his hands and feet grab hold, you'd think he's got suction pads at the end. One of them wrapped himself around the bosun, and it took 2 of us to tear him off. Naturally, the bosun and the carpenter got extra dough for the job, $50, plus an extra 50 smackers if less than 10% died on the way. So they were pretty damn careful. Chips the carpenter was a bull-headed ox with a queer, mushy streak in him, and he worried about the monks like they were kids, and he swore bloody murder whenever one died. I nearly bust a gut to see him peering in every cage to find out if one of his little friends were okay, because I knew he was as tough as they come. Chris, the bosun, was probably the only guy in the merchant marine who could have bunked with Chips. Chris was half-deaf, so maybe that's why. Besides, he was a tough baby, too, and anyone who's ever sailed under him knows he's a miserable character. Knows he was a miserable character because he got his when the shooting broke out. It's about time I got to that. But if you didn't know everything I've just told you, you'd never believe what happened. Easter Sunday it started. Most of the day we'd plowed right along, calm as a Hudson River dayline excursion. But along about 1600 hours at the end of the second watch, Sparks picked up a few faint distress signals. Too far away for him to get them clearly, but close enough for us to realize trouble was on the way. The only question was, how far off was it? Orders came down from the old man to check guns and lifeboats. Guns! That was a hot one. We'd left the States unarmed except for a couple of 45s the skipper packed, which we might as well have traded in for slingshots. And at Suez, we took aboard some heavy stuff. A Browning machine gun that sure as hell dated back to the First World War. Just the thing to scare the pants off a Jap cruiser. As far as the lifeboats went, we were a little better off. Like most rust buckets her age, the Silver City had 4 lifeboats hanging from gravity davits on the boat deck. Besides that, before sailing from the States, we'd rigged up 2 rafts on the forward deck. That night, the card games busted up early. I went on deck and found a couple of the other guys there, saying nothing, just sitting around. It gave me the shivers. A blacked-out ship plowing ahead into a black night, no sounds except the throbbing beat of the propeller and the gibbering of the monks. I wound up with a real case of the willies, so I ducked below and hit the sack. I'd be lying if I said I slept through the night. By 6 a.m. I was up and around, restless as the devil, and I wasn't the only one. But nothing was new, and I just killed time until Belly Robber decided to give us chow. I didn't have much of an appetite to begin with, and by 7:20 I had none at all. That was when Bliven, the ordinary seaman on the 4 to 8 watch, came down to make sure we were up. He was so pale his freckles stood out like splattered ink spots, and he was clenching and unclenching his fists. "Sparks just came up on the bridge," he said, "to tell the old man he'd picked up an SOS. The Pawnee, shelled and sinking, 30 miles from here." "What's the skipper doing about it?" "He's going to head in for Vizagapatam," Bliven said. "That's our nearest port right now. And he's got the chief on deck. I think they're aiming to dog down the valves." Kelsey and the First and me looked at one another. We were in for a nasty watch. The ship's boilers had been inspected and the safety valves set for 196 pounds where they'd been sealed. Now the inspector's seal would be broken and the lever shifted so that we could build up the pressure to maybe 250. Only nobody knew whether the boilers would take it without blowing up. Kelsey was all for trying to talk the skipper out of it. He was, that is, until shortly before we were due to relieve the 3rd watch. One of the ABs came off the bridge to let the men know that Sparks had gotten a 2nd SOS, this one from the SS Halifax, 7 miles nearer than the Pawnee had been. The entire crew was to stand by for orders. Even Kelsey understood that the old man had to risk a boiler explosion. So when we went to the engine room and saw the valves already dogged down, none of us said a word. If the order was to get this tub to 12 knots, we were set to bust a gut trying. As the pressure went up in the boilers, so did the heat in the engine room. And so did the tension. My ears strained for the telltale sounds. The popping of rivets or the buckling of plates and tubes. Then the lookout spotted a vessel on the horizon tearing along in our wake. At the same time, because of the heavy steaming, our stack began to smoke. The old man blew his top and bellowed down to the First that he'd cut his heart out if that smoke wasn't cleaned up in 10 seconds. But already it was too late. That Jap cruiser was on our tail, and we couldn't have given it the slip in a million years. Down in that hot hellhole, where we couldn't see a thing, we knew anyway that the shells would soon be falling. The general alarm was rung, sending the rest of the crew to battle stations, which for our ship meant firefighting posts and lifeboats, while we slaved in 120-degree heat to get half a knot more out of those engines. Suddenly, the ship shuddered, and we knew we'd been hit. The First yelled to me to hop up on deck and see what the score was, because he couldn't get through to the skipper. There was a good reason why he couldn't. The cruiser had bracketed us with its 2 first shells. The 3rd had torn through the shelter deck not far from the machine shop, killing one wiper and injuring a 2nd as they were trying to secure the gear. A 4th shell had struck almost simultaneously square on the bridge. The AB at the wheel was dead. The skipper's legs were shattered. Sparks, who'd been sending out an SOS ever since the cruiser hove into sight, made his way to the old man, carrying a bottle of scotch with him. But the old man wouldn't stay on the bridge. He'd taken an American flag out of the locker. And now, with Sparks dragging him, he made his way to the poop deck where he raised the flag on the afterstaff. Then, after Sparks started back to his station, the old man stood erect and, cursing like a lunatic, shook his fist at the Jap cruiser until the 5th shell landed. The old man vanished. The flag hung in shreds. I realized it was up to me to get the rest of the black gang on deck. As I passed the monkey cages, I saw that a few had been blasted open by the last shell, and Chips, who was on the afterdeck with the fire squad, weeping with rage, seized a crowbar and began breaking the hasps on all the other cages. If only I'd had the brains then to stop him! But I didn't. And so out those creatures swarmed, climbing into the rigging in panic, their cries mingling with the screams of the wounded on deck, making my ears ring wildly and my flesh crawl. Then the 6th shell ripped into us. If it had come 40 seconds later, it would have gotten me, for it entered below the waterline directly above the boilers. The engine room blast shook the entire ship. I was blown against a bulkhead and stunned for a moment. Live steam and tongues of flame whipped up the ladder, and though I tried to keep going down to see what I could do for the First and Kelsey and Borland, the steam drove me back. But I knew that nobody could have lived through that. Now the ship with its motors silenced, was eerily quiet. With all the lights out, I had to grope my way back in the dark. When finally I stumbled onto the forward deck, I found some of the men who were left alive gathering around the chief mate. Almost all of them were wounded, and the mate himself was soaked with his own blood. He ordered the rafts launched and told us to dive in after them. With that, he dashed back to the midship house and shouted to the men on the boat deck to lower their boats or else jump overboard and make for the rafts. They tried to drop one boat, but its lines were fouled and it capsized, so they let the others go and leaped into the sea. A few managed to climb down to the water level and start swimming from there. So did most of the monkeys. Chirping shrilly, they swarmed over the sinking ship, riding it like a logger on a slow-spinning log, until they had to take the plunge into the water. We hardly noticed them. Only 16 of us made the rafts. A few others were clinging to bits of wreckage. We yelled to them to stick close if they could. A monkey swam up to the raft I was on, and Belly Robber reached down to pull it out of the sea. It, too, was a living fellow creature. No one wanted it to die. But suddenly I realized that hundreds of the monks were coming our way. Someone screamed. Not 100 yards away, we saw a seaman hanging onto a piece of timber, and arms and legs wrapped around his neck was a monkey, tearing at him with its teeth. "Oh, God," groaned Belly Robber. "It's Sparks." Then I recognized the guy, only now his thin and sour face was convulsed with terror, and his eyes seemed to be popping out of his head. As I watched, incredulous, I saw another monkey join the first, and still another, ripping away mercilessly to get that hunk of wood from him. And even as we stood there, every last one of us paralyzed with horror, we saw blood flowing from Sparks's face, and he began to scream like a madman until the water closed over his head. Dozens of the creatures had reached our raft and were pulling themselves aboard. I don't know who leaped at them first. Maybe it was me. All I remember is that we became animals too, making wild sounds deep in our throats. Well, not all of us. Some of us were too weak from loss of blood, but the others fought to keep the monks off. It was horrible. We tried kicking their heads off, but they were so damned fast they could duck and swing up before we'd recovered our balance. Belly Robber lost his footing and plunged into the sea, and it was all I could do to drag him aboard. And by that time, it was too late. We had to fight it out on the raft. Fight? That's a laugh. I've been in barroom brawls and shorefront gang battles where a man can get his skull split wide open, but nothing was ever like this. Those monks had 4 arms, because they could gouge our eyes with their feet just as well, and their teeth were razor sharp. And terror had made them insane, so they screamed wildly and their eyes rolled and twisted with rage. Even as I got my hands on one, others were wrapped around my legs. I couldn't shake them loose. I managed to work my fingers onto the neck of the monkey, and I held it, and then I squeezed, ignoring the others until this one was dead. Then I seized its feet and used the corpse to beat at the others. Once I'd gotten them off me, I flailed away with the dead monkey at any that came near. Even so, I was bleeding from several cuts, and I saw that a few of the men on the raft, exhausted by the ordeal of the sinking, could hardly raise their arms to struggle against the beasts. I gave the dead monkey to Belly Robber and waited for another to jump me. This one was a bull, but I was set for him. He leaped straight at me. I let him grab hold of my left arm, and then I whipped my right hand around and got him on the back of the neck, tightening there. But before I knew what had happened, that bull Rhesus had spun around behind me, his hands around my throat. Panic-stricken, I reached back to seize his head. His teeth slashed my fingers, yet I kept on groping until I had him. With that, he sank his feet into the back of my neck, and for an instant the shock and pain paralyzed me so that I almost let him go. But in a fury, I took a tighter hold on his neck, and enraged, I twisted. I heard it snap. body went limp. I can't be sure what happened after that. All I remember is that we used their dead to beat them back into the sea, and that when we had finally driven the last one off, 2 of the 9 men on our raft lay there with blood gushing out of open wounds. One of them was Belly Robber. Within the hour, they both were dead. The rest isn't important. Sparks's SOS had alerted a passenger ship bound for the U.S. They spotted us and took us aboard. Any of the businessmen on that ship, or the missionaries who were returning from posts in Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Burma, can testify to this tale. They got it firsthand from the 7 of us, and the surviving 5 from the other raft. All the way back, the passengers worried about the Japs. But for those of us who had been picked up, there were other nightmares. And me, I still have them. I wake up in the middle of the night, scared stiff and sweating like a pig, and not until I've got the light on do I believe that I'm not being strangled by insane monkeys.